The sick cat was found lying on a grave. When the woman discovered whose it was, the truth moved everyone to tears. Eleanor Vance found a certain peace in the quiet pathways of Hopewood Cemetery. It lay on the eastern edge of the small Vermont town where she had settled into retirement, a place nestled amongst rolling hills that blazed with color in the autumn and slept under deep blankets of snow in winter. The cemetery was old, some headstones dating back to the early 19th century, their inscriptions softened and blurred by decades of wind, rain, and frost. Gnarled maples and sturdy oaks stood sentinel among the plots, their branches often draped with moss, lending the place an air of tranquil melancholy rather than morbid gloom. For Eleanor, whose own life held the quiet echo of past sorrows, the loss of her husband Frank years ago, and the absence of her grown daughter living far away, walking the winding gravel paths offered a space for reflection, a connection to the continuity of lives lived and remembered. It was during one of her walks in late October, when a persistent cold drizzle had settled over the valley for days, that she first saw him. Tucked against the base of a weathered gray granite headstone, partially sheltered by an overgrown lilac bush that had long shed its leaves, was a small, miserable-looking knot of orange fur. An orange tabby cat, skinny and rain-darkened, was curled into the tightest possible ball, trying to make itself small against the damp chill seeping from the earth and the mist swirling in the air. Eleanor paused, her heart giving a familiar pang of sympathy. Stray cats weren't uncommon on the edges of town, often seeking refuge where they could find it. This one looked particularly forlorn. She assumed it had just ducked in among the stones to escape the worst of the drizzle. Murmuring a soft, "Poor thing," she continued her walk, expecting the cat to vanish once the rain stopped or a better opportunity arose. But the next day, the drizzle continued, and the cat was still there, huddled in the exact same spot. It lifted its head as Eleanor approached, regarding her with wide, wary green eyes, but didn't flee. It simply watched her pass, then tucked its head back down as if conserving every bit of warmth. Intrigued and concerned, Eleanor detoured on her way home via the town's small general store. She purchased a can of salmon-flavored cat food, an indulgence perhaps, but the image of the shivering cat stayed with her. Returning to the cemetery, she approached the gravesite cautiously. The cat watched her, tense, but not bolting. Eleanor spoke softly. "Here you go, little fellow. Something to warm your belly." She opened the can and placed it on the grass a few feet away from the headstone, then retreated to a respectful distance to watch from the path. The cat remained curled for a long moment, seemingly weighing caution against hunger. Finally, driven by need, it uncurled stiffly, stretched its thin body, and padded hesitantly towards the offering. It ate quickly, nervously, darting glances back towards the perceived safety of the headstone. It didn't finish the can, consuming perhaps only half before seeming satisfied, or perhaps needing to retreat. After a brief, cursory lick of its chops, it turned and walked deliberately back to its spot against the granite base, curled up again, and closed its eyes, pointedly ignoring Eleanor. Eleanor frowned slightly. It was odd behavior. Most strays she encountered would devour offered food ravenously, then either vanish or hang around hopefully for more. This cat ate just enough, then immediately returned to its vigil by the grave. Over the following week, the pattern repeated. The weather fluctuated, more rain, a couple of days of weak, watery sunshine, then back to damp chill. But regardless of the conditions, the orange cat was always there, pressed against the base of that same weathered headstone. Eleanor made it part of her daily routine to bring food, sometimes dry kibble she bought in a small bag, sometimes another can. The cat learned to anticipate her arrival, lifting its head as she came up the path, sometimes even taking a few steps towards her before stopping, still wary. It always ate, but never greedily, and always, without fail, it returned to lie beside the gray stone as soon as its immediate hunger was sated. Eleanor found herself increasingly puzzled and undeniably touched by the cat's persistent presence at this specific spot. It wasn't just seeking random shelter anymore. There were drier, more protected nooks nearby under larger monuments or denser bushes. This felt different. It felt deliberate, as if the cat was waiting for someone or guarding something. The sight of the small, steadfast creature holding its lonely vigil day after day began to occupy her thoughts long after she returned to her own quiet, empty house. Who or what was connected to this particular patch of earth that commanded such unwavering loyalty from a stray cat? The routine settled into a quiet rhythm over the next few weeks. As November edged towards December, bringing sharper frosts and the first threat of real snow, Eleanor's daily visits to the cemetery became a fixed point in her day. She'd bundle up against the cold, tuck a small container of cat food and perhaps a thermos of hot tea for herself into a canvas bag, and make her way to Hopewood. The orange cat, whom she'd started thinking of simply as the keeper for his steadfast presence, would usually be waiting, a small patch of color against the increasingly bleak landscape. He had grown slightly less wary of her. He no longer waited for her to retreat before approaching the food. Sometimes he'd even allow her to sit on a nearby bench while he ate, though he still maintained a cautious distance. He looked marginally better. The food was likely helping, though he remained lean, his movements economical, conserving energy against the cold. But his core behavior remained unchanged. After eating his small portion, he would inevitably return to the granite headstone, groom himself briefly, then curl up against its base, often tucking his paws beneath him, settling in for another long watch. Eleanor found herself spending more time there each day, sipping her tea, observing the cat, and contemplating the grave itself. It was clearly old, the granite weathered smooth in places, patches of dark green and gray moss clinging stubbornly to its surface, blurring the inscription. It wasn't elaborate, a simple upright slab tilted slightly with age, but it possessed a certain quiet dignity. Unlike some of the more recently tended graves nearby, this one showed signs of long neglect. Dead leaves gathered thickly around its base, obscuring the edges, and the lilac bush beside it grew wild and untrimmed. Who lay beneath this stone, seemingly forgotten by the living, yet attended so faithfully by this stray creature? The question began to loom larger in Eleanor's mind. The cat's unwavering devotion to this specific spot felt too pointed to be mere chance or habit. Was there a scent lingering that drew him? A memory of kindness associated solely with this location? One crisp, clear afternoon, after Keeper had finished his meal and resumed his usual post, Eleanor felt a stronger pull of curiosity than usual. The low winter sun angled across the stone, highlighting the textures of the moss and the faint indentations of lettering beneath. On impulse, driven by a mixture of respect for the forgotten person buried there and a desire to understand the cat's mysterious vigil, she decided to try and read the inscription. She knelt carefully on the cold, damp grass, mindful of her aging knees. Using her gloved hand, she began gently brushing away the accumulated debris, brittle leaves, twigs, clinging damp soil from the base of the stone. Then, carefully, she started scraping away the thicker patches of moss covering the engraved letters. It came away easily in damp clumps, revealing the carved granite underneath. The stone was cold and slightly rough beneath her fingers. Slowly, painstakingly, letter by letter, the inscription emerged from beneath its shroud of time and neglect. First, a name, Arthur P. Abernathy. Then the dates, 1928, 2017. Arthur P. Abernathy lived 89 years. Died fairly recently, just a few years ago, yet the grave already felt decades old in its neglect. The name meant nothing to Eleanor immediately. She hadn't lived in the town her whole life, having moved here after Frank passed away, seeking the peace of the Vermont hills. Abernathy wasn't a name she recognized from the store or the town meetings she occasionally attended. She sat back on her heels, looking from the newly revealed name to the orange cat dozing peacefully against the stone, seemingly oblivious to her efforts. Arthur P. Abernathy. Who were you? She wondered silently. Did you love cats? Did you know this particular orange one? Did he belong to you? Cleaning the stone felt like a small act of respect, a gesture towards reclaiming this forgotten life from anonymity. But it hadn't solved the mystery of the cat's behavior. It had only deepened it by giving the focus of his vigil a name. Why here? Why this man? The connection felt strong, undeniable, but its nature remained elusive. Eleanor packed her empty thermos and food container, gave Keeper a final lingering look, and headed home, the name Arthur P. Abernathy echoing quietly in her thoughts, entwined now with the image of the steadfast orange cat keeping watch in the silent cemetery. Her quiet walks had unexpectedly presented her with a puzzle, one she felt increasingly compelled to solve. The name Arthur Abernathy lingered with Eleanor over the next few days. It felt significant, a key waiting to unlock the small mystery playing out in Hopewood Cemetery. She couldn't shake the feeling that understanding who Mr. Abernathy was would somehow explain the orange cat's unwavering devotion to that particular spot. During her daily visits to deliver food, she'd look at the cleared name on the stone, then at the cat she privately called Keeper, and wonder about the life that connected them. Her chance to learn more came during her weekly trip to the Maple Corners General Store, a quintessential Vermont establishment that served as post office, grocery, hardware source, and unofficial town news hub. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, a woman whose knowledge of local history and personalities was as extensive as her inventory, was sorting mail behind the counter when Eleanor came in to buy birdseed and stamps. After making her purchases, Eleanor hesitated, then decided to broach the subject casually. "Mrs. Gable," she began, "I wonder if you might know. I was walking in Hopewood Cemetery the other day, up in the older section near the back wall, and I noticed a headstone for an Arthur Abernathy. Died just a few years back, it seems. The name wasn't familiar to me." Mrs. Gable paused, pushing her spectacles up her nose, her eyes taking on a thoughtful, slightly distant look. "Arthur Abernathy? Oh yes, Artie. Lived in that little salt box house just past the cemetery gate, the one almost hidden by the overgrown hedges now. Kept to himself mostly, especially after his wife passed decades ago. Never had children." "He lived right near the cemetery?" Eleanor asked, feeling a flicker of understanding. That would place his home within the cat's familiar territory. "Practically next door," Mrs. Gable confirmed, nodding. "Quiet man. Didn't come into town much, just for essentials. Some folks thought he was a bit odd, a recluse. But," she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "he had a soft spot bigger than anyone knew." "Oh?" Eleanor prompted gently. "Animals," Mrs. Gable stated simply. "Stray animals specifically. Cats mostly. Couldn't stand to see one hungry or cold. Used to leave food out near his back step, regular as clockwork. And folks used to say," she added with a chuckle, "that he knew every stray cat in a 5-mile radius by name, even though he hardly knew his human neighbors." Eleanor's heart gave a little jump. "Did anyone ever mention an orange one? An orange tabby?" Mrs. Gable's eyes lit up with recognition. "An orange Tom? Skinny fella?" "Yes. Artie called him Rusty. Said he reminded him of an old hinge he could never quite fix." That cat was one of his regulars for years. Wary little thing, never let Artie get too close, but always showed up for dinner. Used to see him sometimes, slipping through the cemetery fence on his way to Artie's place around dusk. The pieces clicked into place with sudden, poignant clarity. Keeper wasn't mourning at the grave in some mystical human way. He was returning to the familiar territory, the specific area where he knew kindness and sustenance had reliably appeared for years, provided by Mr. Abernathy. The grave itself, located within that remembered territory near the man's former home, likely just offered the best available shelter or landmark within the cat's mental map of Abernathy's place. He wasn't guarding the dead. He was waiting, perhaps, with the persistent hope of instinct, in the last place he associated with the source of care that had vanished from his life. His vigil wasn't necessarily grief as humans understood it, but a profound instinctual loyalty to place and memory, a testament to the impact of the reclusive old man's quiet, consistent kindness. Eleanor felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Sadness for the lonely man who had found companionship with strays, empathy for the confused cat still returning to the place its benefactor used to be, and a deep respect for the simple, unassuming connection they had shared. "Artie passed away in his sleep," Mrs. Gable continued softly, her earlier cheerfulness subdued. "Neighbor found him after not seeing smoke from his chimney for a couple of days. No family nearby to handle things, so the town took care of the arrangements. Small service, just a few folks. That cat, Rusty, haven't seen him around since Artie died. Figured he'd moved on or, well, you know how it is with strays." "He's back," Eleanor said quietly. "He's been staying by Mr. Abernathy's grave for weeks now. I've been leaving him food." Mrs. Gable looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Well, I'll be." "Faithful little thing, isn't he? Even if he is just waiting for a handout in the wrong spot now." She sighed. "Poor Artie. He would have worried about that cat." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. She thought of her own quiet house, the lingering silence left by Frank's passing, the ache sometimes still sharp for the daughter living across the country. She thought of the lonely old man and his quiet acts of kindness, and she thought of the steadfast orange cat waiting patiently in the cold. Mr. Abernathy would have worried. And now, Eleanor knew she couldn't just leave him there, waiting indefinitely for a kindness that would never reappear in its old form. She thanked Mrs. Gable for the information and headed home, her canvas bag feeling lighter, her purpose clear. Keeper needed more than just handouts at a graveside. He needed a home. Making the decision to offer Keeper a home felt right, a quiet continuation of the kindness Arthur Abernathy had shown. Acting on it, however, required patience. Keeper, or Rusty, as Mr. Abernathy had known him, was still fundamentally a wary stray, accustomed to the freedom and dangers of outdoor life, his trust in humans likely limited to the transactional relationship he'd had with his former benefactor. Eleanor understood she couldn't simply scoop him up and expect him to adapt. She continued her daily visits, but her approach shifted subtly. She started spending longer periods sitting quietly on the bench near the grave after leaving the food. She spoke to him more, her voice low and soothing, telling him about her day, about the birds at her feeder, about Mr. Abernathy. "Your friend," she called him. She didn't try to get closer than the cat seemed comfortable with, respecting his space, letting him set the pace. Slowly, Keeper began to relax slightly in her presence. He'd still retreat to the headstone after eating, but sometimes he would sit there watching her, blinking slowly rather than immediately curling up to sleep. One crisp afternoon, emboldened perhaps by familiarity or the strengthening effect of regular meals, he finished eating and, instead of returning to the stone, sat down just a few feet from the bench where Eleanor sat, and began meticulously grooming his paw, acknowledging her presence in his territory without overt fear. Eleanor saw this as an opening. She started bringing slightly more enticing food, tuna, warmed chicken scraps from her own dinner. She placed the bowl a little closer to the bench each day. She avoided direct eye contact for long periods, knowing it could be perceived as a challenge, instead observing him with soft, peripheral glances. The breakthrough came nearly 2 weeks later. Eleanor was sitting quietly, reading a book while Keeper ate his offering of tuna nearby. When he finished, he looked towards the headstone, then hesitated. He looked back at Eleanor, sitting quietly on the bench. He took a tentative step towards her, then another. Finally, with a caution that tugged at Eleanor's heart, he leaped silently onto the far end of the bench, curled into a compact ball, and closed his eyes, emitting a faint, rumbling purr. Eleanor froze, hardly daring to breathe, her book forgotten in her lap. He had chosen to be near her, voluntarily sharing her space. It felt like a profound gesture of trust. She remained perfectly still for a long time, simply savoring the quiet companionship, the small weight of his presence at the other end of the bench. After that day, progress quickened. Keeper grew bolder, sometimes rubbing briefly against her ankles when she arrived with food. He allowed her to gently stroke his back while he ate, his purr growing louder, less tentative. Eleanor knew the time was right. One relatively mild morning, she brought not just food, but a sturdy cat carrier lined with a soft towel. She placed his food near the open carrier door. Keeper eyed it suspiciously, but hunger won out. While he ate, Eleanor spoke softly. "Time to come home, Keeper. Time for a warm bed. Mr. Abernathy would want you to be safe." When he finished eating, he looked at the carrier, then at Eleanor. She held the door open invitingly. After a moment's hesitation, perhaps sensing her calm intent or simply curious, he sniffed the entrance, then stepped cautiously inside. Eleanor quickly and quietly latched the door before he could change his mind, her heart pounding slightly. The walk home was filled with anxious meows from the carrier, but Eleanor kept up a steady stream of soothing talk. Inside her small, tidy house, she released him in the quietest room, the spare bedroom, where she had prepared a litter box, food and water dishes, and a soft bed made from an old quilt. The adjustment period took time. Keeper spent the first few days mostly hidden under the bed, emerging only at night to eat and use the litter box. Eleanor didn't force interaction. She simply spent time sitting quietly in the room, reading or knitting, letting him get used to her presence in this new environment. She left tasty morsels near his hiding spot. Gradually, curiosity began to outweigh fear. He started exploring the room when she was there, then ventured out into the hallway, then the living room. He discovered the warmth of the heating vent, the intrigue of dust bunnies under the sofa, the entertainment value of watching birds from the windowsill. He slowly learned the rhythms of Eleanor's quiet life. He remained cautious, startled easily by loud noises, but his wariness towards Eleanor melted away. He began seeking her out, rubbing against her legs, leaping onto her lap when she settled in her armchair in the evenings, his purr a constant, comforting rumble. He claimed the worn armchair opposite hers as his own, often dozing there while she read or watched television. For Eleanor, the silence of her house was transformed. The quiet was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was punctuated by the soft padding of paws on the floorboards, the gentle rhythm of a purr, the occasional soft meow demanding dinner or attention. Keeper's presence was a steady, living warmth that eased the lingering ache of her own losses in a way she hadn't expected. Caring for him, ensuring his comfort and safety, gave her days a renewed, gentle focus. Sometimes, looking at Keeper snoozing peacefully in a patch of sunlight, Eleanor would think of Arthur Abernathy, the reclusive man whose quiet kindness had forged this unlikely connection across time and circumstance. She felt she was honoring his memory by giving his Rusty the safe, warm retirement the old man would surely have wished for him. In rescuing Keeper, Eleanor found she had also rescued a piece of herself, discovering that even after loss, the heart could find new ways to connect, to care, and to be warmed by the simple, profound gift of companionship. Winter arrived in earnest, blanketing the small Vermont town and Hopewood Cemetery in deep, silencing snow. Eleanor no longer made her daily walks to the graveyard. The paths were impassable, and more importantly, Keeper was safe and warm inside. He showed little inclination to venture out into the cold, white world visible through the windows. Having known the harsh realities of surviving outdoors, he seemed perfectly content with indoor comforts. The radiator cover in the hallway became a favorite napping spot, second only to the sunbeam that crept across the living room rug in the late mornings. Their days settled into a gentle pattern. Keeper often served as Eleanor's furry alarm clock, appearing silently beside her bed around dawn, sometimes reaching up a soft paw to pat her cheek until she stirred. He'd follow her into the kitchen, winding around her ankles with soft meows as she prepared their respective breakfasts, oatmeal and tea for her, his preferred kibble for him. While Eleanor read the local paper or tended her indoor plants, Keeper would either settle nearby, purring, or engage in quiet explorations, batting at a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam, or intently watching the chickadees and nuthatches visiting the bird feeder outside the window. His personality, cautious at first, continued to blossom in the security of Eleanor's home. He wasn't a boisterous cat, retaining a certain quiet dignity likely learned during his years fending for himself, but he revealed moments of surprising playfulness. A crumpled piece of paper could suddenly become a fascinating toy, batted gleefully across the floor. A dangling pull cord on a window blind might invite a sudden focused stalk and pounce. He also developed a voice, conversing with Eleanor in a series of soft chirps, trills, and questioning meows, particularly around meal times or when he desired a spot on her lap. Eleanor found herself talking back, narrating her activities, sharing anecdotes about her day, sometimes even confiding quiet thoughts about Frank or her daughter, Carol. Keeper would listen, or seem to, blinking slowly, occasionally offering a soft meow in response. It wasn't the same as a human conversation, of course, but the act of voicing her thoughts to this attentive, non-judgmental companion felt surprisingly cathartic. The heavy silence that had often felt oppressive after Frank's death had been replaced by the small, comforting sounds of another living being sharing her space. She started sleeping more soundly, the faint weight of Keeper often settling at the foot of her bed during the night. When spring eventually arrived, melting the snow and bringing the first tentative crocuses pushing through the damp earth, Eleanor resumed her walks, though less frequently directed towards the cemetery. One mild afternoon, however, she did return to Hopewood, carrying a small trowel and a pot of cheerful yellow pansies. Keeper remained at home, snoozing in his armchair. Eleanor walked directly to Arthur Abernathy's grave. The stone she had cleaned months before was still clear, his name stark against the granite. She knelt and carefully planted the pansies at the base, adding a small splash of color to the quiet spot. "Just thought you should have some flowers, Mr. Abernathy," she murmured softly, patting the soil smooth. "And you should know, you're Rusty. Well, I call him Keeper now. He's doing just fine, safe and warm. He's a good companion." She stayed for a few minutes, feeling a quiet sense of peace, a connection not just to the memory of the kind, reclusive man buried there, but to the chain of quiet compassion that had linked his life to hers through a stray orange cat. Leaving the cemetery, Eleanor walked home with a lighter step. The grief for her own losses hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her days. Life felt richer, imbued with the simple, rewarding rhythm of caring for another being, and being cared for in return in that unique, unspoken way animals offer. Keeper greeted her at the door with an expectant meow, rubbing against her legs. Eleanor smiled, bending down to stroke his soft fur. "Hello, Keeper," she said warmly. "It's good to be home." Together they went inside, closing the door on the lingering chill of early spring, two solitary souls finding unexpected warmth and companionship in the quiet twilight of their lives. They left a dead puppy at a cabin, but a stray cat did the unthinkable. What secret could a wary stray cat be guarding near an empty rental cabin, refusing to leave days after the renters are gone? The elderly caretaker is baffled by the orange cat's strange, persistent behavior until the cat's actions lead him to a shocking discovery hidden behind the woodshed that explains everything. Subscribe, like, and listen to this touching story of silent witnesses, unexpected loyalty, and second chances. The rental cabin, quaintly named Whispering Pines, sat nestled deep within a tract of dense hardwood and pine forest bordering the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. Accessible only by a winding gravel road that discouraged casual traffic, it offered seclusion, rustic charm, and a quiet pierced only by birdsong, rustling leaves, and the occasional chatter of squirrels. It was precisely this isolation that had appealed to Sarah and Ben, a young couple from Atlanta seeking a weekend escape from city noise and demanding jobs. What they hadn't fully factored into their romantic getaway plans was the boundless, chaotic energy of Pip, their 10-week-old terrier mix puppy. Pip was all needle-sharp teeth, boundless enthusiasm, and zero bladder control. They'd acquired him impulsively the week before, envisioning cozy evenings by the cabin fireplace with a cute puppy snoozing at their feet. The reality involved constant supervision, cleaning up accidents, redirecting chewing from furniture legs to appropriate toys, and trying to manage Pip's yelps of loneliness when briefly confined to the unfamiliar travel crate they'd brought. Their idyllic escape quickly became strained by the demands of puppy ownership for which they were fundamentally unprepared. The cabin itself was charming but rustic, with wide gaps beneath the raised porch, a slightly musty smell, and screen doors that didn't quite latch securely. Critters were a part of the experience. Field mice rustling in the walls at night, raccoons investigating the trash cans, deer grazing silently in the misty mornings. And then there was the cat. He was a creature of the surrounding woods, a lean, nameless orange tabby with watchful green eyes and a ragged tear in one ear. He haunted the edges of the few rental cabins scattered through this part of the forest, surviving on his hunting prowess and the occasional carelessly left scrap or spilled morsel. He was wary, elusive, a fleeting glimpse of ginger fur against the backdrop of ferns and fallen leaves. Let's call him Rusty. Rusty had learned to associate the sound of arriving cars with potential opportunity, but also with unpredictable, noisy humans. So he kept his distance, observing from the shadows. He watched Sarah and Ben arrive, heard the high-pitched yapping of the small, clumsy creature they carried inside, and noted the unfamiliar scents marking this temporary occupation of the cabin. Sarah and Ben tried to include Pip in their weekend plans. They took him on short, stumbling walks on the nearby trails, let him explore the cabin's dusty corners, and attempted to cuddle him by the fireplace. But their patience wore thin quickly. They wanted to hike longer distances, sleep in late, enjoy quiet meals without constantly watching the puppy. Pip was often relegated to his crate for longer periods than recommended, his whimpers echoing unanswered in the small cabin. Or he was put outside on the porch, tethered loosely, while Sarah and Ben tried to relax indoors, hoping the fresh air would tire him out. Rusty observed Pip from a distance during these outdoor stints. He saw the puppy's frantic energy, its attempts to chew the tether, its lonely cries when left unattended. Rusty felt no particular kinship. Dogs were usually trouble. But he registered the small creature's vulnerability and the human's inconsistent attention. He remained hidden, a silent observer of the temporary dramas unfolding at Whispering Pines, unaware that his path was about to intersect tragically with that of the little terrier mix. The second afternoon of their stay, Sarah and Ben decided to leave Pip tethered on the shaded porch while they attempted a more ambitious hike to a nearby waterfall. "He'll be fine for a couple of hours," Ben reasoned, silencing Sarah's half-hearted protest. "He needs to learn to be alone for a bit, and he's got water." They secured his leash to a porch railing, filled his water bowl, tossed a chew toy nearby, and set off, eager for some uninterrupted adult time. Pip, predictably, hated being left alone. He whimpered, then barked, then threw himself against the end of his tether, trying to reach the tantalizing forest edge. He chewed frantically on the nylon leash. In his panicked struggles, he managed to loop the leash around one of the wooden porch posts in a tangled knot. He pulled harder, twisting, whining pitifully. The knot tightened ominously around his small neck. His frantic movements became weaker, his breathing restricted. There was a final brief struggle, a desperate gasp, and then silence. Pip lay still against the porch post, the tightened leash having done its accidental fatal work. Several hours later, Sarah and Ben returned from their hike, flushed with exertion and the beauty of the waterfall, their earlier frustrations momentarily forgotten. As they approached the cabin, they expected to be greeted by Pip's excited yapping. Instead, there was only silence. "Pip? Buddy?" Sarah called out, a flicker of unease touching her. They rounded the corner onto the porch and saw him, lying still by the post, the leash taut around his neck. Ben rushed forward, fumbling with the knot, his hands shaking. Sarah let out a strangled cry. It was immediately clear Pip was gone, lifeless, cold. The beauty of the afternoon shattered, shock, horror, and then overwhelming guilt washed over them. This wasn't an illness. This wasn't unavoidable. This was their fault. Their carelessness, their desire for convenience over the puppy's well-being had led directly to this small, awful tragedy. Panic quickly followed guilt. What would they tell the cabin owners? Would they be blamed, fined, reported for negligence? The thought of facing the consequences, explaining their irresponsible actions, was terrifying. In their youthful immaturity and fear, they made a terrible decision. We can't tell them," Ben whispered, his face ashen. We have to get rid of him before we leave tomorrow morning." Sarah sobbed, but didn't argue, too consumed by shock and shame. Under the deepening twilight, Ben untangled the leash from the small body. He couldn't bear to just leave him on the porch. He carried Pip's limp form around to the back of the cabin, near the dilapidated woodshed where firewood was stored. He found a shallow depression behind the shed, hidden by overgrown weeds, and gently laid the puppy down, covering him hastily with loose leaves and pine needles. He tossed the leash and the now hated chew toy into the nearby woods. Back inside the cabin, they avoided looking at each other, The cozy atmosphere was gone, replaced by a heavy pall of guilt and shared secrecy. They barely spoke, packed their bags with frantic, jerky movements, and cleaned the cabin obsessively, trying to erase any sign of their presence, any sign of the puppy. They left hours before their scheduled checkout time, driving away in the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Whispering Pines and its tragic secret behind them in the silent woods. Later that morning, long after the sound of their car had faded, Rusty emerged cautiously from the deep woods. He had been disturbed by the humans' panicked energy the night before and their unusually early departure. He approached the cabin warily, sniffing the air. The scent of the humans was fading, but mixed with it was the lingering scent of their fear and something else. The faint, distinct odor of recent death, stronger now near the back of the cabin, by the old woodshed. Driven by caution and curiosity, Rusty followed the scent trail. Behind the shed, amongst the weeds, he found the source. The small, dark-furred puppy he had observed on the porch lay partially covered by leaves, utterly still. Rusty sniffed the small body, recognizing the finality. He looked around. The humans were gone. The puppy was alone, abandoned. Like before, a strange instinct warred with his ingrained caution. He should leave, find food, avoid this place heavy with the scent of death and human distress. But he didn't. He settled down a few feet away, partially hidden by the weeds, but with a clear view of the small leaf-covered mound, and began his watch. Something about this felt profoundly wrong, and his feline instinct, honed by survival, but perhaps retaining a flicker of something more complex, compelled him to stay, a silent orange witness to the cabin's sad secret. Walter Henderson wasn't much for surprises. At 76, a widower for nearly a decade, his life ran on the predictable, comforting rhythms of habit and necessity. He lived year-round in a small, sturdy house just down the gravel road from the cluster of rental cabins that included Whispering Pines. For the past 15 years, since retiring from his job at the local lumber mill, he'd acted as the unofficial caretaker for several of the cabins owned by folks who lived downstate or out of state. He kept an eye on things, handled minor repairs, checked pipes in the winter, and often did the basic cleanup between renters during the busy season. It gave him a modest income, a sense of purpose, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to get out and about. He knew the woods, the cabins, and their transient inhabitants well. He also knew the local wildlife, including the elusive orange tabby cat that frequented the area. He'd seen Rusty many times over the years, a fleeting glimpse darting across the road, a pair of green eyes watching him from the underbrush. He knew the cat was wild, wary, and utterly uninterested in human contact, surviving entirely on its own wits. So, when Walter drove his old pickup truck up the winding drive to Whispering Pines 2 days after Sarah and Ben's abrupt departure, the first thing he noticed felt immediately wrong. There, sitting squarely on the top step of the cabin porch, was the orange cat. It wasn't hiding, wasn't fleeing. It was just sitting there, bolt upright, staring towards the closed cabin door. "Well now," Walter muttered, pulling his truck to a stop. "That ain't right." Rusty never lingered near the cabins when people were around, or even when they had just left. He certainly never sat bold as brass on the porch steps. Walter got out of his truck slowly. The cat turned its head, fixed him with an intense stare, let out a low, insistent meow. Not a greeting, more like a demand or a complaint, and then turned back to stare pointedly at the cabin door again. It didn't run. Walter felt a prickle of unease. He walked towards the porch, his old boots crunching on the gravel. Rusty held his ground until Walter was halfway up the steps, then leaped off silently and trotted around to the back of the cabin, disappearing near the woodshed. But instead of vanishing completely into the woods as usual, Walter could still see the cat lingering near the shed, watching him. Shaking his head slightly, puzzled by the cat's strange behavior, Walter unlocked the cabin door and went inside. He was immediately struck by how clean it was. Almost too clean. Suspiciously clean. The young couple, Sarah and Ben, had left early, according to the owner who'd called him yesterday, leaving the key under the mat. Usually, weekend renters left some sign of their stay, a few dishes in the sink, overflowing trash, maybe a forgotten magazine. This place felt scrubbed, sterile, and there was a faint, lingering smell he couldn't quite place. Disinfectant, maybe, trying to cover something else? He did his usual checks. Windows latched, no obvious damage, fridge empty. Everything seemed in order, yet the cat's odd behavior and the cabin's sterile feel left him feeling vaguely unsettled. He stepped back outside onto the porch, intending to check the woodshed for kindling supply. As he rounded the corner of the cabin, he saw Rusty again. The cat was sitting near the dilapidated woodshed, staring intently at a patch of disturbed leaves and weeds just behind it. When Rusty saw Walter approaching, he let out another sharp meow and pointedly looked from Walter to the spot in the weeds, then back again. He seemed agitated, insistent. Now Walter was truly concerned. The cat's focus wasn't random. It was specific, deliberate. His earlier unease crystallized into a definite sense that something was wrong here. He walked slowly towards the woodshed, his gaze following the cat's intent stare. Rusty retreated slightly but stayed close, watching Walter's approach, making low, anxious chirping sounds. Walter stopped near the patch of disturbed leaves. He could smell it now, faint but unmistakable. The sickly, sweet odor of decay, masked slightly by the scent of pine needles and damp earth. His heart sank. He reached down carefully and brushed aside the top layer of leaves. Beneath them, partially hidden, was the small, still body of a black puppy. It was clear it had been dead for a couple of days. Walter straightened up slowly, a deep sadness settling over him. He looked from the poor creature in the weeds to the orange cat watching him anxiously from a few feet away. "So that's it," Walter said softly, his voice heavy with understanding. "That's what you've been trying to tell me, isn't it, fella?" The cat hadn't guarded the body directly this time, perhaps instinctively knowing it was better hidden. Instead, it had guarded the place, the vicinity of the cabin and the shed, using its persistent, unnatural presence and behavior near the structure to draw attention to the hidden tragedy. It had stayed, waited, and tried, in its own feline way, to sound the alarm. Walter felt a surge of respect for the wary stray, mixed with anger at the carelessness and cowardice of the humans who had left this small life behind like so much forgotten trash. Walter stood for a long moment behind the woodshed, the quiet weight of the discovery settling upon him. The cheerful birdsong from the surrounding forest seemed jarringly inappropriate. He looked down at the small, still form of the puppy, then over at Rusty, who sat watching him with unwavering intensity, as if waiting for Walter's response, needing acknowledgement of the wrongness he had guarded. Walter's first instinct was anger. Anger at the young couple whose carelessness and panic had led to this quiet tragedy and disrespectful abandonment. But anger wouldn't help now. What mattered was offering some measure of dignity to the puppy and acknowledging the extraordinary loyalty of the cat. He knew he should probably report it, like Sam Harding had done in the similar situation down by the highway last year. But out here, with rental cabins and transient visitors, tracking down the couple responsible felt unlikely, perhaps even futile. The owners of the cabin lived hours away. Involving them would just cause distress and likely lead nowhere. What felt more important, more immediate, was giving the puppy a proper resting place and recognizing the cat's profound act. He made a decision. He wouldn't call the authorities this time. He would handle it himself, quietly, respectfully. He went back to his truck and retrieved the same tools Sam had used, the small foldable shovel, an old but clean tarp. He returned to the woodshed, moving slowly, speaking softly to Rusty. "All right, cat," he murmured. "I'm going to take care of him now. You did your part. You made sure he wasn't forgotten." Rusty watched intently as Walter gently uncovered the puppy fully, his expression somber. Walter carefully lifted the small body onto the tarp, wrapping it securely. He looked around, seeking a suitable spot for a burial away from the immediate cabin area, somewhere peaceful. He chose a spot deeper in the woods, under a tall, ancient oak tree where dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves. Rusty followed at a distance as Walter carried the bundle towards the oak tree. The cat moved silently through the undergrowth, pausing occasionally to watch, his initial agitation replaced by a quiet, observant presence. It was as if he needed to see the process through. Walter dug a grave in the soft earth beneath the oak, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed the tarp-wrapped puppy inside, then stood for a moment, hat in hand. "Sorry this happened to you, little one," he said quietly. "Hope you find some peace now." He filled the grave, carefully replacing the earth and covering it with leaves and moss to blend it with the forest floor. When he was done, he turned and saw Rusty sitting nearby, watching the spot where the puppy now rested. The cat let out a soft, almost sighing sound, then began to meticulously groom his front paw, a gesture that felt strangely like closure. Walter felt a sudden, strong sense of responsibility towards this cat. Rusty had shown loyalty, intelligence, and a strange sort of compassion that deserved recognition. Leaving him to fend for himself in these woods, especially after his vigil, felt wrong. He walked back towards the cabin, Rusty trailing cautiously behind him this time, further back than before, but not vanishing entirely. Walter completed his check of the cabin's interior, finding nothing else amiss besides the faint, lingering odor he now suspected was from the panicked humans trying to clean up after the puppy's initial demise inside. Before leaving, Walter went to his truck. He always kept a small bag of emergency supplies, including a few cans of tuna and some bottled water. He opened a can of tuna and emptied it onto a clean, flat stone near the woodshed, where Rusty often lurked. He poured fresh water into a discarded plastic container he found nearby and rinsed out. He didn't try to approach Rusty directly. He simply left the offering and got back into his truck. As he drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror. After a moment, the orange cat emerged from the woods, approached the stone cautiously, sniffed the tuna, and began to eat hungrily. Walter drove home with a heavy heart, saddened by the puppy's fate, but deeply moved by the cat's actions. He knew he couldn't just forget about Rusty. The cat had borne witness, had sounded an alarm in his own way, had connected with Walter across a species divide through shared acknowledgement of a tragedy. Walter felt bound to him now, determined to offer the wary, loyal stray the consistent kindness and support he clearly deserved, hoping to slowly bridge the gap between the wildness of the woods and the quiet comfort of a haven. Walter made visiting Whispering Pines, specifically the area around the woodshed, part of his daily routine, even when the cabin wasn't rented. Each day he brought a small offering, sometimes canned food, sometimes dry kibble he bought specially, always fresh water. He'd place it near the woodshed, call out a quiet, "Here you go, Rusty," and then retreat to his truck or sit quietly on the cabin steps, allowing the cat space. Rusty learned the routine quickly. He would often be waiting near the woodshed when Walter arrived, appearing silently from the trees. The initial deep wariness began to soften, replaced by cautious anticipation. He allowed Walter to get closer before retreating to eat. He stopped flattening his ears or growling, instead watching Walter with intelligent, assessing green eyes. Walter talked to him during these visits, his voice low and calm. He spoke about the weather, the goings-on in town, memories of his late wife, Martha, who had also loved animals. He wasn't sure if Rusty understood the words, but he seemed to respond to the gentle tone, sometimes blinking slowly or offering a soft chirp in reply. One crisp autumn afternoon, several weeks into this ritual, Walter arrived to find Rusty sitting directly beside the food bowl spot, waiting. As Walter approached, Rusty didn't retreat. He stayed put, looking up expectantly. Walter placed the food down, his hand only inches from the cat. Rusty sniffed the food, then looked up at Walter, and for the first time, leaned forward and rubbed his head firmly against Walter's outstretched hand before starting to eat. Walter felt a lump form in his throat. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. After weeks of patient effort, after acknowledging the cat's silent vigil, trust was finally being offered. He sank down slowly onto the ground near the woodshed and watched Rusty eat, feeling a profound sense of connection to this resilient orange survivor. From that day on, their bond grew steadily. Rusty allowed Walter to stroke his back while he ate. He started following Walter around the cabin grounds when he did his checks, padding silently behind him through the woods. He even rubbed against Walter's legs sometimes, purring loudly. As winter approached, bringing frost and the threat of snow to the mountains, Walter grew increasingly worried about Rusty surviving the cold. The woodshed offered minimal protection. He thought about trying to trap the cat, to bring him home by force, but he didn't want to betray the trust they had built. One particularly cold morning, Walter found Rusty huddled shivering near the woodshed, his orange fur puffed out against the biting wind. "This won't do, Rusty," Walter said firmly but gently. "You can't stay out here like this." He opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck, just as Sam Harding had done for Sonny in that other story Walter had heard about. He didn't coax or call. He just left the door open, an invitation to warmth and safety, while he went about placing the food and fresh water. Rusty watched him, then looked at the open truck door. He shivered again as a cold gust swept through the trees. He looked towards the deep woods, his familiar, harsh sanctuary. Then he looked back at the truck, at the human who had consistently shown him kindness, who had understood his silent message by the woodshed. After a long, contemplative moment, Rusty walked deliberately towards the truck, paused at the threshold, and then leapt gracefully onto the passenger seat. Walter's heart swelled. He closed the door gently, got into the driver's side, and started the engine. Rusty settled onto the seat, looking out the window as they drove slowly down the gravel road, away from Whispering Pines. He wasn't just a stray anymore. He was Walter's cat. Back at Walter's cozy, warm house, Rusty explored cautiously at first, but soon found his favorite spot in a patch of sunlight on the living room rug, near the wood stove. He and Walter settled into a comfortable companionship. Rusty remained independent in many ways, enjoying supervised excursions into Walter's fenced backyard, but he always returned to the reliable warmth and gentle company inside. He often sat with Walter in the evenings, sometimes on his lap, sometimes nearby, their shared presence filling the quiet house. Walter often found himself telling Rusty stories, recounting his day, sharing memories, and sometimes, looking into the cat's knowing green eyes, he felt sure that Rusty, the silent witness, the loyal guardian, understood far more than anyone might think. The tragedy at the cabin had cast a long shadow, but from it had emerged an unlikely, enduring light, the quiet, steady glow of friendship found, and a haven finally reached. Winter melted into a gentle Appalachian spring, and the woods around Walter's home came alive with birdsong and blooming dogwood. Inside, the rhythm of life had found a new, steady beat. Rusty, no longer the lean, wary stray, had filled out, his orange coat thick and gleaming. He moved through Walter's house with the quiet confidence of a creature who knows he belongs. He still possessed his independent spirit, spending hours watching birds from the windowsill or dozing in sunbeams, but he was never far from Walter. Evenings were their quiet time. Walter would settle into his worn armchair with a book, the fireplace casting a warm glow across the room. Rusty would often leap onto the ottoman, curling up near Walter's feet, his deep purr a soothing counterpoint to the crackling logs. Sometimes, Walter would look down at the sleeping cat, remembering the fierce, loyal sentinel he'd found by the woodshed near Whispering Pines. He'd marvel again at the strange, unbreakable instinct that had kept Rusty there, guarding a tragedy, ultimately leading him here to this safe harbor. The profound loneliness Walter had felt since Martha passed hadn't vanished entirely, but it had softened, its sharp edges smoothed by Rusty's unassuming companionship. The house no longer felt empty, it felt occupied, shared. And for Rusty, the harsh uncertainty of life on the fringes had been replaced by unwavering warmth, reliable meals, and the gentle presence of the human who had understood his silent plea. They were two solitary souls, brought together by a somber discovery, now finding quiet comfort and unexpected grace in the simple rhythm of their shared days. Proof that even after loss, new bonds could form, bringing light back into the quiet corners of a life.